This panel has been underway for a couple of years now. We have, it's an endeavor funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and our charge is huge. We are asked to consider what kinds of theory helps us understand contraceptive transition. And with special reference to the last, let's say 20, 30, 40 years in low and middle income countries, but not exclusively that. So in so doing, we are tackling it. Irene, you're there. Yes? Well, Irene, I've already started. I'm sorry. Well, our strategy is we have commissioned a set of papers. We are aiming to have an edited volume, a collection of 9 papers, one of which will provide empirical background that's provided by Vladimira and John Bungartz, and 8 papers that are on various domains of theory, economic theory, diffusion theory, the role of family planning programs, fertility desires, and so forth. That's 4 of the 8 right there. What we've done for today is to give us some further insight on this, some further help with this. We invited all the authors of papers to join us, and they should be someplace here, hopefully, in this webinar. I'm getting a message here, but I don't quite understand. Okay, I think I'll continue. But we've asked 5 persons to help us with this, to give us their brief insights about if they had this charge, that is the theory of contraceptive transition, where would they put their emphasis? And those 5 are Teresa Castro-Martin, John Cleland, Giovanni Medice, Professor Srinivasan, and Amy Choi. And we're delighted they have taken up this assignment, and they will get introduced in turn. So right now, I think I'm going to, that's all the introduction I want to give. I think it says simply enough what we're about. And I'd like now to pass the session on to Vladimira, who has some slides. And Vladimira's role today is to give us a kind of the empirical backdrop. I think we all know this, but in some fashion, but this will put us on the same empirical foundation. So, Vladimira.
Hello, everyone, and I'm very delighted to be making this introduction for the empirical patterns in contraceptive prevalence trends. And I would like at the beginning of my presentation thank to many of the UNP, the United Nations Population Division, and other colleagues who contributed to the revisions of World Contraceptive Use data compilations on which this presentation is based. So as a data for this short overview of the empirical patterns, I will be using the World Contraceptive Use data compilations, which at this moment contains more than 1,300 nationally representative surveys for 196 countries. And it includes data on contraceptive prevalence by methods, age, and marital status, and unmet need for family planning as data are available. We use Bayesian hierarchical model to generate annual estimates and projections. And this model allows us sharing of information among countries according to a clustering hierarchy and incorporating substantive knowledge. It also allows us to account for biases in the observations, which we classify, and also help us to produce some kind of uncertainty around the estimates, which are reflections of the data availability, but also of the biases present with each of the presentations. At the beginning, I would like also to mention the definition of the contraceptive prevalence, which we use, and it's expressed as number of women using contraception over the total number of women of reproductive age. And we also split this group of the total of women of reproductive age to married in union women and unmarried not in union. And without further ado, I will just go to the one slide on the global trends. So among 1.9 billion women of reproductive age living in the world, 932 million users, 932 million women use contraception, which is around 49% of this age group. And while you see a large increase in the number of the users in terms of the numbers, in terms of proportion, this has changed only a little. What has happening is also a change in the composition of the women, where the women of reproductive age are living in the world. As a first view at the countries, I selected 6 countries with quite varied contraceptive use transitions. And this first slide is for married in union women. So for Colombia, we actually have in the data compilation data from 1970s covering the whole part of the increase in contraceptive use. For Ethiopia, the increase in contraceptive use started later, so it's around 2000 and increasing. In France, in our data set, the data from the 1970s already show a high use of contraceptive methods, though most of them at those times were the traditional methods. India shows an increase, and then quite a long stable period since 2000 where contraceptive use did not change much. Japan is an example of a country which, after reaching around 60%, we actually in the most recent 2 surveys, we see a decline in contraceptive use. In Nigeria, it's the country where still the contraceptive use is very low. It's only less than 20% of women who are married in union are reporting using a contraceptive method, and did not increase much over the past 20 years. Around 14% of contraceptive users globally are women who are not married in union. So it has become much more important also to look at the group of unmarried women. And here I again say, so we look at all women who are unmarried. So the dimension of the comparison also, one needs to take into account the differences in sexual activity among the countries. So we see Ethiopia and India still low prevalence of contraceptive use among unmarried women, while increasing in Colombia over the past 30 years. In France, we have seen already quite high levels in the first surveys in which we have from 1977. However, again, the traditional methods were quite prevalent. For Japan, we have very few information. And in Nigeria, the contraceptive use among unmarried, it's also low and not changing much in the past years. Next to the overall trends, we can also look at the trends by age. So this is looking from the life course perspective. And here, for each of the countries, so it's again the same set of countries as in the first 2 figures, we see for each of the countries very low, comparatively low contraceptive prevalence at age groups 15-19. And it's mainly due to lower sexual activity in this age group. However, for other age groups, there are large differences. So for instance, in Colombia, already 60% of all women age group 2024 are using contraception, while it's very low in India. And over time, we see increase across all age groups when contraceptive use is increasing. When looking at the methods, the situation is quite different for countries. So we see estimates for around 1995, 2005, and 2015, and its overall contraceptive prevalence among all women of reproductive age split by the methods used. So both Colombia and India have a quite high proportion of the use of female sterilization. However, in Colombia, it's complemented by a wide range of other methods. In India, other methods are rarely used. In Ethiopia, so that recent increase in contraceptive use is linked to the increase in the injectables and implant. In France, we see predominance of pill methods. Historically, however, there's a small decline between the 2005 and 2015 estimates among the users of the pill, and increase in the IUDs. In Japan, overall, the main method used are male condoms and some of the traditional methods. And in Nigeria, we see none of the methods actually kind of takes a large part of of the contraceptive use. And so in summary, the global data compilations and annual estimates are informative for identifying general patterns of contraceptive transitions, but also exceptional patterns, stalls, and declines. For data and reports, please visit Population Division website. So there are all the data, methods, and the results. And I'm very much looking forward to this panel and discussions about how to explain this diversity of the patterns in contraceptive use increase. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vladimira, and welcome everyone. I'm Ann Biddlecom. I am on this IUSSP panel, and I'll be facilitating what is going to be a very interactive panel, and yet with our crossing time zones, crossing borders, and grappling with Zoom challenges, everyone is slowly becoming from an attendee to a panelist. That is on purpose. So that's so that you can have more agency to unmute yourself and ask a question. But that said, this is going to be rather fast-paced as conference sessions go. We've invited, as was mentioned earlier, reflections from 5 experts to 2 questions. And we're going to, and the reflections are meant to be brief. So the first round will be in response to a question. I'll post it in the chat so everyone understands what we're talking about. Each expert will have around 5 minutes or so to share their insights and views, and then we'll open discussion up to the floor briefly for about 15 minutes. And then we'll go back again to a second overarching question, again, inviting insights from the experts, and then open the floor back up to everyone who's in this session for your additional insights, questions, challenges, whatever you would like to share. And then we'll have a brief closing. So let me introduce our experts. And this is not going to do any justice whatsoever to the wealth of experience and intellectual contributions. I'm only going to relay title and affiliation. So we have with us Teresa Castro-Martin, who's a research professor at the Spanish National Research Council. Welcome, Teresa. You see her there live. We also have John Cleland, who is Emeritus Professor of Medical Demography at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Hello, John, welcome. And with a lot of books behind him, so thus proof of his intellectual history. We have Giovanni Medice, who is the Director of Development Policy and head of the Malawi office of the African Institute for Development Policy. Welcome, Giovanni. We have Krishnamurti Srinivasan, who is was director and senior professor at the International Institute for Population Sciences in Mumbai from 1978 to 1992 and is now emeritus professor. Welcome. And we have Amy Choi, who is professor emerita in the Population, Family, and Reproductive Health Department at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Welcome, Amy, who is going incognito as conference attendee. Not on purpose, I hope, yes. And so, in short, we are drawing on not only a lot of eminent expert insights, but also a lot of emeritus eminent expert insights. And so without further ado, I'm going to begin with the first question. And that question is, the panel's mission is to formulate a framework for explaining contraceptive transitions across time and place. If you had this charge, which theories would you emphasize or what factors would you stress? And so I'm going to turn the floor over first to Teresa, And you had some slides you wanted to draw from, yes? And so I'll leave it over to you to share your screen, or if there's a problem, I have the slides and I can do so for you.
Okay, let me see. Okay. It's okay. Okay. Well, I apologize because I prepared some rapid presentation, but I hadn't read the questions. I mean, I just read them when I finished the PowerPoint. So I'm not bringing theories here because I just forgot about this email. But I think I have some ideas, and probably other panelists can link them to the best theories. So it's just some thoughts when we talk about contraceptive transition, or when we talk about contraception. I think the first thing we have to reach a consensus or something is that what we mean by contraceptive access or contraceptive protection, contraceptive agency, contraceptive rights, because I mean, we don't, we must not forget that contraception is just a mean. I mean, the goal is to control your reproduction or to have the desired family size, just a means to get to that. So I think we have to have this always in mind, that contraception, what it does is to allow to match desired reproductive aspirations or intentions, so we can control family size and desired pregnancies and births. It's also a means of agency, so so women and also men can design their own sexual and reproductive life courses. On one hand, the number of children, but also the timing of pregnancies. So timing is very important also. So we should be having access to different methods, because demands of different methods change according to life stage. So we have to have always this in mind, that maybe contraceptive prevalence is not good enough because prevalence could be we can achieve the same prevalence with different mix, and we have to know that is the right mix. So the demand varies a lot by life stage, by age, by partnership situation, sexual frequency, parity. I went. No. Parity, and sometimes with ambivalence of fertility intentions. Some people are not sure if they want to have a child or not, so they don't use contraception. Sometimes they do. I mean, it's very related to intentions, and how strong are those intentions. Demand also depends on health conditions of the person, and how easy is to access. I'm talking about money, the cost, time to get it, and also cultural and religious barriers. Also, we can talk about contraceptive as a sexual and reproductive health right. So it means we need to counteract existing barriers to this right based on socioeconomic or class position, or different institutional support to contraception that is different in different societies, cultural climate, gender inequalities, and so on. If it's a right, it's a right for everybody, no matter where you live or what position you have in society. I think it's also important to see contraception linked to the right to enjoy sex without the fear of pregnancy, regardless of marital partnership or parity status. And probably this perspective is not too much emphasized in contraceptive literature. And also, contraception means the women's right to control their own body, to decide whether and when to become a mother or not, to shape their futures and their families. And this should be so regardless of the views of society, of the extended family, their peers, their religious community, and even their partners. Well, this is my view. It could be a little bit controversial. And also regardless of given government or state interests. So that's a little bit the view I have. I have three more. I'm not sure
Teresa, yeah, I would
long.
say in the interest of time, because we're at the end of the 5 minutes, but I know your next slide actually touches on the second question that we had. So if you wouldn't mind, we could come back again and start there. Is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And so if you stop sharing your screen, we'll move over to John Cleland.
Thank you, Anne. Well, I've got 5 minutes and I've got 5 points. By the end of this session, I think I'll know what speed dating is like. The big question is, do I want to date this panel or do I want to spurn them? Anyway, so 5 points. In my view, any theory of contraceptive transition must be subordinate to and nested within broader fertility transition theory. After all, about 70% of fertility decline is attributable to increased contraceptive use. The two cannot be disentangled. Point 2, as a broad framework for the work of the panel, I can't think of an improvement over Easterlin's 3 constructs: supply of children, demand for children, and costs of fertility regulation. Now, I guess that the creation of this panel is based on the premise that costs of regulation, very broadly defined, vary across populations, change over time, and act as an important independent influence on the timing and speed of fertility change. That's certainly been my view for many years. And strikingly supportive evidence comes from John Castelline, the chair of the panel, in his IUSSP presentation on Wednesday, showing that most increases in contraceptive use, and by inference, declines, a large fraction of fertility declines, stem from improved implementation of childbearing preferences rather than decline in preferences themselves. And of course, implementation of preferences depends on costs of regulation. An important related issue is whether or not falls in the costs of regulation, broadly defined, and the spread of contraceptive practice exert an influence on demand for children. In other words, does acceptance of the means to achieve a goal strengthen or modify or change the motive? Based on these Easterling constructs, the panel might, if they're foolish, attempt a crude typology of populations. Let me give some examples. The first category might comprise populations characterized by low demand for children and low costs of regulation. And I would cite much of East and Southeast Asia and Latin America in this group. And that combination would translate to early and rapid contraceptive transition. The second category of populations might comprise those with low demand for children, but high initial costs of regulation. And I would indicate that South Asia fits into this category. And that combination would translate into delayed transition, evidence of opposition, initially slow change, but acceleration over time, and with government family planning programs being of particular importance. And the final and third category might consist of populations with high demand for children and high costs of regulation, as I think characterizes much of sub-Saharan Africa. And you would expect in those situations to see delayed transition, you'd expect to see the falls in demand for children being needed for achievement of very high levels of contraceptive use, and possible plateauing or stalls of contraceptive use at levels well below the maximum. Point 4, with regard to specific theories, it's clear to me that concepts of innovation diffusion will be most appropriate. It fits the Western experience from 1880 to 1930, where the crucial innovation was the moral acceptance and diffusion of a behavior previously regarded as repugnant, namely withdrawal, the sin of Onan. It also fits populations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where new alien modern methods may at first encounter deep suspicion and provoke anxiety. The huge problem facing the panel is our collective failure to develop quantitative measures of the costs of regulation beyond simple components such as knowledge, pricing, and physical access. We have abundant evidence from ethnographic and qualitative studies that there is initial resistance in many populations to the idea and methods of fertility regulation, but corresponding evidence from surveys is virtually nil. A final speculation, could you infer, to the extent that you're in any way convinced by what I've said, could you infer costs of fertility regulation indirectly from the persistence and nature of unmet need, unwanted fertility, or similar measures? So your task is daunting, it's awe-inspiring, but I wish you every luck. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And this already gives some of the dynamism of what's at stake here with ideas. I turn it over to Giovanni, please.
Thank you so much. I think I have spent too much time with John because I also came up with 5 points. So John, you're a bad teacher. You have corrupted me. But I wanted to start by asking the question, for whose benefit are we doing this? Because I thought that what Teresa showed was actually giving us from the individual's perspective, why we want to look at contraceptive, the transition, and also look at contraceptive use more generally. But then if the aim of looking at the contraceptive transition is perhaps to look at achieving goals, for example, reduction in fertility or in population growth, achievement of sustainable development goals, improvement in women's health, then my thinking was that perhaps what you've called the government and state type of framing, where essentially we are looking at the family planning programs as being the drivers for the contraceptive transition, might be what we're looking for. But in that, I want to hasten by saying that you may then get into a situation where contraceptive inequity might actually be significant, and you want to look at that, especially at the start. From my experience with the family planning, state-run programs or state-sanctioned programs, there is a greater emphasis on married women to the disadvantage of sexually active and married women. So there you might begin to see some of the inequities there, where high contraceptive prevalence is achieved for the married women and less so for unmarried women. And certainly that is something that I have seen here in Malawi. Things are improving, but when you look at access to contraception for those who are sexually active but not married, you see the disparities there. The other thing I wanted to talk about is really looking at what you call the cultural systems and social diffusions. I would like to maybe start by saying, cultural systems can mean so many different things. And sometimes people use that to mean, more emphasis on traditional methods. But I'm finding that that label doesn't work anymore. What Vladimir showed with Japan having quite high levels of traditional methods of contraceptive use does suggest that, if we use culture to mean traditional or, less use of modern, then perhaps, the culture will take a very different meaning altogether. I do like the social diffusion theory, because I think that is what I have observed in a number of the African countries, where we do have the forerunners who are the wealthier, we have the more educated, and sometimes those who live in urban areas and they're married. And then you have the diffusion to lower socioeconomic groups. Yeah. So this is, I think, the model, and John called it innovation and diffusion. And definitely we can also see with the innovation, for example, as implants became more accessible, you see that you have more and more of the forerunners, wanting to use these methods. But the forerunners sometimes they change. So it may be that there are those women who really want to space or limit pregnancies and essentially do not want the burden of going again and again for pills, etc. So the transition there might, change in terms of the subgroups who are in the forerunner category. The final thing I really want to say, which is to do with maybe the forerunners idea, and then the increase in traditional methods that we are seeing more and more, and seeing that we are getting more of the educated, women, couples, choosing these traditional methods compared to, say, decades ago, 20, 30 years ago, where traditional methods was synonymous with less educated, rural women and less wealthy. Now things have changed. So when thinking about that and looking at the method mix, the transition may have a very different meaning compared to the transition in the 80s, in the 90s, etc., where we may even have had the shift from traditional to modern methods for women. But here we are beginning to see also a shift from modern to traditional, particularly amongst the wealthier women. And then if these wealthier women are the forerunners, then what are the implications for traditional methods? Will we see an increase, more broadly in society for traditional methods? And if that is the case, what are the implications for support for these women in the contraceptive provision systems? Because my understanding in many countries is that there isn't really support for this type of methods because they're not considered as part of the method mix, and they're more to do with the individual preferences. So I'll park there, and then I'll come back when you ask me for the second question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nyovani. And for those who joined, we're going in 2 rounds. But after the last 2 of our 5 experts, we're going to open the floor for comments or questions. And then we're going to proceed to the next question. The first question is in the chat. It's not about sterilization in India, but it is before. So I would like to now turn the floor over to Professor Srinivasan. And Professor, you had some slides. I don't know if you want to share your screen, or I can here.
Share it here. Can I do that?
Yes, please.
Are you able to see this?
No, we cannot. If it's easier, I can try and share my screen from here, and you leave your mic. Oh, yes. We have
Able to see
success.
that?
We
Yes,
have
nice to-
success.
Yeah, nice
Thank
to see
you.
my old friends, Amy Chai and John Cleland. You know, let me share some views on these problems of contraceptive transition theories. So the first one is the underlying uh, mechanisms of that are these three. One is contraceptive prevalence rate in any population at a given point of time is determined by three major factors. One is the extent of the desire of couples to state or limit the number of children they have by adopting artificial modern methods of family planning. Two, the availability, accessibility, and affordability, 3 A's of the modern methods of contraception. And three, the social and economic costs of adopting the methods for the couples and the population. Now, this has been taken into account in the note prepared by the group for our discussion. But there are some problems for specific countries. In India, that had extensive use of sexual abstinence by couples for cultural, social, and religious reasons for long periods in history, there is a switchover from traditional to modern methods. And the impact on fertility had to be measured in terms of the net impact. The availability of induced abortions under the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act has also an impact on the use of modern methods of contraception. Now, since the beginning of the National Program of Family Planning in '52, the emphasis has been placed on male sterilizations until '77 and on tubal ligation after 1977. Now, tubectomy is the dominant method of family planning in India, even now. It is as popular in Kerala that have achieved below replacement level of fertility a decade earlier, and in Bihar that has a PFR of around 3. India has the largest pool of sterilized females in the whole world. Governments at the state and the central level are taking efforts to persuade couples to go for other temporary methods of contraception such as IUDs, oral pills, condoms, but without much success. With a relatively lesser proportion prevalence by sterilization compared to other methods, temporary methods, have similar impact on fertility can be reached. When a sizable proportion of couples decide to use other temporary methods of family planning, instead of sterilization, as the governments hope to achieve, there will be a sudden rise in the CPR values, and when they go back to sterilization, there will be a drop in CPR value. Thus, the contraceptive transition at higher levels in India will not be a smooth logistic curve going to an asymptote, but will be a fluctuating curve after a peak level of 50 or around is reached. This has been proved empirically. Thus, while CTT can be expressed as a logistic curve with the 3 parameters for many countries, namely the asymptote, pace of increase at the time of sharp increase in the CAP and the timings, for India and for many other countries, including Brazil, this will not be applicable since there will be a good deal of fluctuations in the CPR values. The last phase of CPR curve is more likely to be a sine curve with fluctuations among different values in a band, switching between sterilization with other temporary methods like in Italy and in India. Now, we can see this curve. I have given it by note. It is not here. I don't know. I gave. Is it with you? I sent it to John Chesterton's PA. It is a sine curve instead of an asymptote. So it is a modified logistic curve with the 3 parameters, but instead of asymptote being a straight line, it will be a sine curve. The curve goes like this and then fluctuates like this. And this is what is happening in many European countries also. Italy has got a low CPR but very low TFR. So similarly for other countries, there is a lot of fluctuations that are likely to take place when populations switch between natural methods and abstinence, coitus interruptus, and modern methods. So this is what I would like to say, that you have to take into account the method mix in describing the contraceptive transition curve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Srinivasan. And then we're going to turn to our final expert, Amy Choi. And maybe Professor Srinivasan, if you could stop sharing. Oh, yes.
This is the last slide. I will close it off.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. And over to you, Amy.
So the benefit of being the fifth panelist is to build on the others, except that I don't have an equation to share like Dr. Srinivasan. But I would say that as Teresa, I read the questions after I developed my comments, but some of my comments are in slides for the next session too. And also like Giovanni, I question what the contraceptive transition theories were for. I mean, were they to help us understand why some populations reach 60% or higher levels of contraceptive use on their own, or does that explanation have to be subordinated to fertility transition theory, as John Cleland has argued? But the agreements that I have are that I totally agree that the cost of fertility regulation aspect or component of the Easterland model is where we need to develop further if we really want to understand uptake and stabilization at high levels of contraceptive prevalence. And I agree with Dr. Srinivasan. I don't think that every population needs to reach 60%. Clearly, that's going to be consonant with a low fertility regime, and not all populations may necessarily reach that point. But nonetheless, I think if we are trying to provide, as Teresa has said, satisfy or align women's and men's desires for contraception with their fertility preferences, we do want to address the cost of fertility regulation. And we want to address, therefore, demand for birth control. In terms of the question and what theories should we have, might we have addressed if we had been in charge of this panel, I would have landed on the diffusion of innovations theory as well. As explicated by Everett Rogers back in the 70s, I think it has withstood the test of time in many ways. And I would, so the diffusion of innovations is, so let me start by saying I focus primarily on contraception, not the other proximate determinants, not abstinence, not abortion, and so on, but contraception as a medical technology. And in modern times, as opposed to traditional methods, which I would embrace wholeheartedly as an innovation as well. But by focusing on contraception, I think we want to address the features of birth control methods, of contraceptive methods, and why those exact costs, particularly psychosocial costs for both women and men who would adopt. Take cases of male sterilization. I think the fear of the loss of virility is an incredibly important force that has lowered the share of total contraceptive use that is attributed to male sterilization. There are very few countries in the world, I counted once about 17, that have any sizable use of male sterilization. And why is that? So the diffusion of innovation model, I think, is very important. Innovation that's communicated through certain channels over time and amongst members of a social system. But other social science theories are relevant. And to this, I think we can look to vaccine hesitancy as an area that we might explore in terms of what epidemiologists and behavioral health behavior researchers have examined in terms of why populations refuse vaccines, for example. Here, the health belief model is one. Certainly, the theory of reasoned action and planned behavior is another theory, the theoretical model that we can examine. But in terms of vaccine uptake and the continuum for vaccine uptake, and I also should preface this by saying these ideas once shared with a colleague, Madeline Short, and which she actually brought it forward, said, why don't we think about vaccine hesitancy as a way of looking at barriers to contraception? So there's in the vaccine hesitancy literature, there is a model of 5 A's: awareness of the health threat, availability of the vaccine, accessibility, its affordability, and its acceptability. And these would resonate for those of us who looked at contraception. But it's the acceptability of the vaccine that I think is something that we could examine further if the aim of contraceptive transition theory is really to explain the higher levels of use. Individual risk assessment plays a major role in vaccine hesitancy. Why would I, as an individual, get a vaccination? Is it because I have a sense of collective of adherence to collective responsibility? Not necessarily. If an individual might reject the vaccine because they do not want to put their person at risk, because of a potential loss of fertility, because of the side effects, also for males because of the potential loss of virility or perceived loss of virility. And so focusing on the acceptability of the vaccine as an innovation, I think is a promising path for this panel. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, Amy. I invite a lot has been offered and put forth with different emphases and distinct emphases. So the floor is open for we'll say like at least 5 minutes because I know we're coming up against the end of the session. I invite the panelists and also the IOSSP panel members to turn on your videos if you'd like. And the floor is open if anyone would like to put forward a view or a question, please raise your hand. Or you can, if you're shy, just go ahead and type it in the chat box. I'll give the floor over to Mahesh Kara and then to John Bangar. It's Mahesh and then Susanna Kavanaji.
Hi, Anne, and thanks everyone for such great comments and a lot of food for thought. In thinking about several of the, I think several panelists brought up what the objective of thinking through contraceptive transitions as they are distinct or overlapping with fertility transitions. And I think that's like an important distinction to make, particularly when we think about what the objective functions are for contraception. I think that John had mentioned that they are inextricably linked, and contraceptive theory and transition should be nested or embedded within fertility transitions. And to some extent, I'm inclined initially to agree with that, but also when we think about what are individuals, couples, households, communities maximizing as their welfare, if we think about modeling this as a welfare metric, what are individuals maximizing when they think about using or not using contraception? One is the demand for children, like the reflection of how women and couples decide how many children they want to have, when they want to have them. That is embedded in the Easterlin and the Beckery models of utility. But another thing that we have to think about is the demand for sex, which was brought up. And the demand for sex and the demand for children may not necessarily be perfectly substitutable, they may be substitutable, or complementarities may exist, and thinking through how we model that insofar as how contraception and the decision whether to use or not to use contraception comes into play, and what type of methods to also use needs to be thought through a lot more. And I think that they're like thinking through the objectives and actually identifying those parameters when we think about how to model transitions is really, really important. So I'll just stop
Thank
there.
you, Mahesh. Thank you very much. Over to you, John Bongartz.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm very much enjoying this discussion. And I agree with most of what's being said, in particularly the focus on diffusion theories and the implementation of preferences. I'm a bit surprised that there is not more discussion of family planning programs. We know from history that the family planning programs in Asia have been very important in bringing about the contraceptive revolution there. We even know from the MATLAB experiments that in a very poor and illiterate society, contraceptive use can jump once you bring in high quality services. The biggest problem right now is that in Africa, where prevalence still is quite low, many governments are not interested in it, and there are a variety of reasons for it. Economists don't think that family planning programs are effective. And governments also believe that desire for children is so high that family planning programs cannot make a difference. In a paper I presented earlier this Wednesday, I showed that family planning programs not only have an effect on unwanted fertility, which is as expected, but also on wanted fertility. And that helps break down the traditional high values put on large families. And in my analysis of countries where we have had successful family planning programs, in Malawi is a good example, Rwanda, Ethiopia, the programs have brought a reduction in wanted fertility. And that is a big part of the reason why these countries have achieved prevalence rates in the neighborhood of 50%. Thank you.
Thank you, John. The floor is open for one or two more interventions, and then we'll move to the second reflection. If anyone would like to offer something up.
And I
yes, very good, Susanna.
Yeah, no, I want just to ask, well, thank you very much for all the comments about the fertility theory embedded in this. I would like to ask Lida and anyone who would like to talk about it. We were thinking about this since the beginning, but we are thinking more about the different patterns, pace of decline, and here would be the increase of CPR, starting points, endpoints, if we have similarity. But when we go to explain why fertility goes down and we want to explain why CPR goes up, would you be saying to us that we are going to end up with this diverse body of theories that no one can agree on it, or there are different points of view, or you're saying that we have to depart from there, take one that is most like acceptable and go from that? So what do you tell us about this?
I'm going to exercise the moderator's whatever role here and say, Susanna, that is spot on, and we have little time. I know that people are, I know that colleagues here could speak at length on that. That's a very provocative question to end on and pivot to our second reflection. There's even less time. John Cleland mentioned that felt uncomfortably like speed dating. Well, the velocity just increased. So we're gonna go in opposite order. So Amy, we'll begin with you. And I know that you may have slides, you may want to share slides. I posted for everyone here what the second reflection is. I'll read it out and then we'll go over to Amy. And that is, the panel is also concerned with the character of contraceptive transitions. Contraceptive prevalence is one endpoint of interest. Are there other meaningful endpoints of contraceptive transition that you would identify? Over to you, Amy.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So as I mentioned, I did my slides before I read the questions. And so I'm going to start by answering the question, which is, I think an endpoint that needs to be monitored is contraceptive method choice, contraceptive method mix, and specifically I think the composition of contraceptive methods is important. And one could even weight the contraceptive method mix by the use effectiveness of each method and come up with a composite number if one wanted to look at the fertility effectiveness of the methods being used. But I just wanted to start by, again, maybe harking back to the objectives of the panel is that, are you expecting to see that the contraceptive transition will mirror the fertility transition? And these are just 5 slides, five trend lines from DHS data ranging from roughly 19 to 28 years, I think, apart. But you can see that the TFR, which is the blue line, and the CPR, this is all methods, CPR, which is the orange line, they don't necessarily go in the same direction. Particularly look at Ghana, where they have both come down. One has come down, one has come up, but they have conversion very different at very different paces. So my next slide is really that to reiterate that I don't think contraceptive method preferences are the equivalent to fertility preferences. And this is again because focusing on contraception as a medical technology invokes decisions on the part of the user and the adopter that are not the same as deciding on whether or not to have children and when to have them. Contraceptive choices change over time in a population and for an individual. This slide is of Indonesia over 3 decades. And you can see that largely only female sterilizations remain constant in an Islamic country. The pill has also remained relatively constant, but the IUD declined and injections increased until more recently when implants, which were earlier used in the form of Norplant and then gave way later and now more recently to the new modern implant as we know it. Very little use of condom as opposed to what we saw in Japan, which by the way has a very liberal abortion practice environment. And then traditional use has even increased slightly. So individual choices about contraception are important to monitor. As you can see, overall prevalence in Indonesia has reached 60%. Lastly, then I just added here, the contraceptive transitions are the outcomes of changing dynamics of personal method choices. And it begins with the acceptability of birth control as a concept, but the acceptance of methods, depending on their features, is really very important in the decision-making. And hesitancy about contraception and use of medications in general is an area that we could measure better. I had already mentioned looking into the literature about vaccine hesitancy, and they identify psychological correlates, some of which we are very familiar to us, but others which have to do with trust and confidence in the medical technology, individual risk perceptions, as well as complacency in terms of whether or not to use. So those are my 3 minutes of comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'd like to turn the floor over now to Professor Srinivasan with respect to other meaningful endpoints for contraceptive transitions.
Sorry, the screen keeps on coming.
Professor,
Yeah.
oh yeah, very good.
And so, you see, I won't show any slides. I think the contraceptive prevalence rate, as it is measured now, is going to be quite a type of a quicksand measure. Because as Amy pointed out, it is essentially dependent on the method mix. And I think the sterilization is going to become like an absorbing barrier, you know, the endpoint, and it is very difficult to wean away couples once they are attracted to sterilization. This is what India is facing, and many Latin American countries are also going that way. So I think rather than trying to put the endpoint as just a contraceptive prevalence, it is better to put it in terms of limitation and spacing. Contraceptive prevalence due to limitation, contraceptive prevalence due to spacing methods. And this gap in CEP, is going to have a very big impact, not only on fertility transition, but also on many other sociological issues of the society. Because we find that the couples who are sterilized in particularly southern states in India, their gender empowerment, especially with female sterilization, their gender empowerment is much stronger. The women's authority at house increases because they don't have that fear of pregnancy at all. They don't fear the husbands. Second thing is the mobility to move, work, and everything is better. There is no fear of unwanted pregnancies coming in the way. So there are many social implications of limitation practices compared to temporary methods. I think this is going to be a thing. So you have to definitely split CPR into CPR due to limitation practices and CPR due to other practices, because they have different implications both for fertility as well as gender issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And over to you, Giovanni, with respect to insights on other meaningful endpoints.
It wasn't me.
I take ownership for that intervention, non-human intervention.
All right, okay. Thank you so much. I think the answer for me is no, we can't just use the contraceptive prevalence as an endpoint. And the 60, I'm not sure where it came from, whether it's arbitrary or has got some deep underlying theoretical reasoning behind that. But I think what we've seen is we've seen slowing in contraceptive prevalence. We've also seen huge inequalities between subgroups, and to just use the prevalence as an endpoint for me is not meaningful. I think we do need to, I was just reflecting on the slides that Amy showed. Ghana is always an interesting country where if we just looked at contraceptive prevalence, we would be saying whatever that means this country is not really transitioning in a progressive way. But if the considerations such as maybe fertility goals or fertility preferences were brought into consideration, then we might want to start asking questions. What is happening in Ghana? Is it to do with women's autonomy? Is it to do with access to other non-contraception ways of achieving fertility desires? Is it things like spousal separation and things like that, which might suggest that women autonomy thing? I also quite liked what Amy said about method mix, and I think method mix is a really important one. And when we're looking at the transitions, we should be looking at increasing method mix rather than decreasing, which sometimes we see happen quite a lot, quite high contraceptive prevalence rates, but a dominance of just one method, and I question the quality of environment where, for example, you have quite a lot of discontinuation and people discontinuing because they are not happy with the method, and then also the issue of individual preferences. And then finally, my point is to do with equity, and I think equity is really an important thing. I think we need to be looking at saying, okay, the end point really is when we actually have very little difference between either socioeconomic subgroups or between ethnic subgroups, caste or urban rural, because that's when we start thinking that, okay, this is an environment where we have really transitioned. It doesn't really matter whether you are rich or poor, urban, rural, or indeed from a particular disadvantaged caste. You do have either the means or the desire to use contraception to achieve your fertility goals. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. Over to you, John Cleland.
Thank you. I'd like to start with a comment to Mahesh Kara. Given the average age, which is pretty high of the speakers today, could he remind us what demand for sex means? Anyway, later on, Mahesh, perhaps you can give me a private tutorial on that. So like Giovanni, I'm not at all keen on prevalence of modern method use as a possible endpoint. Indeed, I can't see any intellectual justification for sidelining other ways in which sexually active couples regulate their fertility by traditional methods and abortion. Consider for a moment the absurdity of concentrating exclusively on modern method use. Look at Albania and compare it with Niger. Albania's had below replacement level fertility for years. Niger has the highest fertility rate in the world, between 6 and 7 births per woman. And yet Niger has a modern contraceptive prevalence higher than that of Albania. So if you stick rigidly to modern method use, the prevalence thereof as your endpoint, you would put Niger higher on the trajectory towards transition than Albania. You'd be a laughingstock. And a related point is that the proliferation of medical abortion really obfuscates the distinction between traditional methods and highly effective modern methods. So I agree with Giovanni on that. Where I disagree, and I would caution against using a method mix as a criterion of progress. This view is based on a complete fallacy that empowered, educated, knowledgeable women and couples that automatically translate to a less skewed method mix than in settings where women and couples are not so empowered, educated, and knowledgeable. But it simply isn't true. The method mix in Germany and in the Netherlands is just as skewed as that in India or Bangladesh. And women I can tell you, because I know several of them, women in Germany and the Netherlands are extremely empowered and very powerful. So forget about method mix. It's interesting, but it's not an easy criterion of progress. So what are the other candidates? The incidence of unintended pregnancy is a candidate endpoint. It's very difficult to measure, and there are complexities in the choice of it as an endpoint. Bongartz and Westhoff, in a paper published over 20 years ago, show that the incidence of unintended pregnancy depends on exposure to risk, namely the proportion of reproductive years spent trying to avoid a pregnancy, that proportion is much higher in countries where low desired family sizes prevail than in countries where family size desires are somewhat higher. So it's complex, but it's a possibility. From a reproductive rights perspective, a high proportion of demand satisfied is the obvious endpoint. However, for those who regard the achievement of low fertility as indispensable for the long-term future of the human race, and that includes me, this measure is problematic because high demand satisfied can be and may be in parts of Africa compatible with rates of fertility that are well above replacement level and that imply continued high rates of population growth. So it's not easy, this endpoint stuff. And well, I have been unhelpful as usual, but there you go.
Not at all. I want to give the last word from the panelists over to Teresa, and I think you had a slide that focused explicitly on this question of meaningful endpoints of contraceptive transitions.
Yes. Oi. Okay, I agree with with all the panelists that I mean, contraceptive prevalence is very not a good quality indicator of the end of the transition. But I would like to question even that there is an end of the contraceptive transition. As I see it, probably there is not an end. I mean, there's still many, many goals to be achieved. So it's a moving target because aspirations change. And some of them cannot even be predicted. They seem surprising, but it's not that surprising. For example, that now educated women are shifting from more modern to traditional methods. I mean, it's happening the same maybe with menstrual, I don't know how to call it, devices. I mean, it's a new trend. So why we are still very far from an end of contraceptive transition? I think still there is an excessive reliance on female contraceptive methods. So is this reproductive women's autonomy, or is an unbalanced burden of contraception? If maybe the end would be a more balanced contraceptive responsibility among men and women. Really, I think we should also research more why such low levels of male sterilization. It's a cheap method, is reversible, I mean, has all the quality things, no side effects. I mean, why is not promoted a little bit more? I know there is such cultural barriers, but I mean, there are also cultural barriers for women. Why men are not inside of the picture much more? With regard to contraceptive method, access or mix or range of methods supply, I think for an outsider, they would judge that there is excessive reliance on sterilization in some countries that have high union dissolution and repartnering. It doesn't make much sense to sterilize at 26 if it's common that you separate and have another partnership. I mean, maybe you want another child. I don't know. And also the stress on long-acting reversible contraception is not really the best for some life stages when you are too young, after a separation until you don't find another partner, after you have been married maybe for 25 years and you no longer have much sex. I mean, it's all depends really the method that is more suitable to you. It depends a lot on how often you have sexual relations, and we don't talk about it, but they change a lot along the life cycle. And also, I think we have to address at some point, because there is a big debate on excessive reliance on our hormonal methods. I mean, we know that the negative side effects are not, maybe not high or large, but if you accumulate over all the reproductive span, you take a pill every day in your life from the mid-teens to menopause, probably these health risks are not minimum. I mean, I don't know much about it, but it's not water. So who is defining this acceptable risk? Why there is not more share of side effects? And why the development of male hormonal methods that would mean that we share all these side effects have stagnated, stalled? I mean, why? Mainly because of concerns. Well, mainly because there is no demand. Remember, I mean, you could induce that through marketing or whatever, no? But I think, I'm not an expert on this, but I suspect that there is the concern of men about negative side effects have a big weight on this stall of research and development. But the side effects are libido, weight, cholesterol. I mean, those are, women have had those side effects since the 60s with the pill. So I don't know, there are too many things to be able to say that we are near the end of the contraceptive transition, even in developed or high income societies. So, well, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Teresa. A lot of points have been raised by all 5 of our colleagues on the panel here. And so I'd like to take at least 5 minutes of a floor open for either panelists responding to each other or things that you would like to follow up on, or also colleagues who are here in this session who would like to ask a question or offer up an insight on other meaningful endpoints for a contraceptive transition, or as Teresa said, maybe that's not even, that's already making an assumption in the question. Floor is open if you want to raise your hand. John Bongartz?
Yes, I would like to point out that contraceptive prevalence is the direct result of 2 factors, the proximate determinants of contraceptive use, if you will, and that is demand and the implementation of demand. So if you want to explain trends in contraceptive prevalence, you have to both look at the demand side and at the implementation side. Given that we are now in a world where reproductive rights are predominant, I think the SDG indicator, which John mentioned, that is the % of women's demand that is satisfied, I would make the first and most important indicator. But as John Cleland's objection can be met by taking a second and closely related indicator, and that's demand. So demand and the demand satisfaction are theoretically very different matters, and they have different theoretical explanations. So doing that would get you around the problems with the CPR and give you much more insight in the trends in CPR.
Thank you, John. And I also offer up, if anyone wants to type into a Q&A or in the chat point or question, please do so. John Casterline, and then Jonathan Barrick.
Yeah, quickly, I just want to thank Amy for her several urges to consider, other kind of medical adoptions, vaccine hesitancy and so forth. And it has seemed to me for a long time we could benefit by, let's call it medical anthropology and understanding health transition. And there's possibility, I think, that part of what's going on with contraceptive transition is it's just one component of a larger health medical kind of transition, just the way people relate to health and to their bodies. So I will say, kind of contrary to John Bongartz, although we don't disagree, I think family planning services make almost certainly make a big net benefit. But I'm also impressed with how much fertility decline occurs where there's weak programs. There's kind of a universality here that makes me think that there's health transition as well as contraceptive transition in some ways is embedded in a large health transition.
Thanks, Jonathan Barrack.
Hi, thanks for a lot of really interesting insights. I really appreciate a number of the thoughts. One thing, for example, that Amy sort of brought up was about vaccines. And I remember this thing stuck in my head several months ago when a colleague tweeted in response to the concern that people had about like a 1 in a million chance of a clot from the Janssen vaccine. And she was and people were saying, oh, you're making too much of a big deal out of this. It's 1 in a million. It's so low. And she pointed out that the risk for the pill was 1 in 1,000. And that was considered to people by others an acceptable risk. But if 1 in a million isn't acceptable, then how is 1 in 1,000 acceptable? And it's something that I like really hit me really, really hard. And I remember, and it was really interesting to think about the points that I think John Cleland made about you have these low fertility countries with high traditional method use. One of the things that we do is estimate contraceptive failure rates. And in the US, unlike the DHS countries, we can correct for abortion underreporting. What we're seeing in the most recent data, unless I screwed up, which is entirely possible, is that someone using a calendar-based method in concert with withdrawal has basically the same failure rate as someone using the pill, and that's adjusting to the best that we can to exposure to risk of sex. And I'm curious, would people think that that might be an exceptional case that wouldn't apply to countries in Africa, for example?
Thank you, Jonathan. We have this space for a minute or two of responses either to some of the points raised or queries. Anything else offered up?
I'd like to just comment on Jonathan's point. And John Casterline's point as well. So I think the 1 in 1,000 or 1 in a million is an abstract concept, and it comes down to an individual decision as to what is appropriate for that person. And that's why I made the point that contraceptive, that the method mix is important to monitor, because it is the accumulation of at the population level of individual decisions. And so it reflects the individual calculus of what is relevant for them. And this goes back to what John Cleland said, that we have not looked at the cost of fertility regulation, or for that matter, the demand for birth control in the same way that we have supply side measures, for example, or looked at preferences. So it's just a matter of spending more of our resources on trying to understand those decisions. And I think the vaccine hesitancy literature can offer a lot. There is, I neglected to mention, there's a 5C scale that looks at confidence, constraints, complacency, calculation, and collective responsibility, which again are dimensions that can resonate with contraceptive decisions, contraception as the technology itself.
Thank you, Amy. I'll turn the floor over to my colleague on the panel, Chandrasekhar, to close the session.
A quick thank you, Anne. So first of all, I would say that personally on my behalf, that at least we got some directions. Of course, on certain issues, further, debate is required. However, I would like to start with first of all the panelists who have given their valuable time for giving us some guidance or some sort of resolution that what should be the end point, as well as what are the factors, or what drive to the contraceptive transition theory. So these two answers I mean, these 2 days panel, of questions of these 2 answers will really help the panel to arrive on some sort of a solid ground and framework to really provide some framework which is, you can say, sustainable. Now, in the first, I would also, thank that, IUSSP panel, giving IUSSP panel as my, colleagues, as well as particularly the Anne, who has like moderate this session, John Castelline, who has chaired this session, because I know that this was long in our mind to discuss on such a important forum. And finally, I would also say thanks to IUSSP itself that they have formed such a panel after thoughtful thinking that there should be a systematic study on developing some framework, as well as I also thanks to BMGF providing the finance and also support for such a important study. And this would be like kind of a landmark for future researcher as well as future theories in these directions. And finally, I would say the support staffs here who had like technical staffs, and the in the last not the least, all the participants who have in the variation of times have been interested to give like their ideas as well as the time, and as well as supporting this as a coming some sort of consensus. So their interest, I see that model frequency was 45 and it remained still around that from beginning to end. So it shows that this is an interest. Personally, I would say that always hearing these these experienced people from my 23-year career as a student to this professor, I always feel like you always have so many things to learn, and their brain is still so active and proactive and thinking directions on such a clear foundation that I think there should not be any confusion to panel to arrive, postulate, or you can say the pathways of, of the theory of contraceptive transition. Thank you very much. Anybody want to add something to that? Otherwise,
I think we're at our end. I think that brings the session to an end. So I've already written a note in the chat, but I thank all of you for a really stimulating session. But great help to the panel and its upcoming work. So all the best, everybody.
thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good session.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, John. Thank you.